Blessed greetings. I am Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker Smith, your moderator for our time together. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this Pan-African Women of Faith, Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network, PAWE. Today is Third Thursdays, and this will be a Third Thursdays webinar series on the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, which is a thematic focus of the WCC. This series will stand in solidarity with the Thursdays in Black campaign. Thanks to you, if you too are wearing Black on this day regarding this. Let us hear from moderator Agnes Aboom around her reflections on Thursdays in Black.
It is so pathetic to see small little girls, children, toddlers, infants being violated by men, by people who should be caregivers, who should be protectors, who should be guarantors of life. Thursdays in Black campaign is an ecumenical campaign that invites men and women, people of goodwill, to join in saying no and to stop the menace and the pandemic of sexual and gender-based violence. So we're dealing with societies that are traumatized, societies whose wholesomeness in terms of life are actually compromised. Now, when you have a society that is traumatized, trauma denies you the abundant life that we preach. Trauma denies you your dignity. Trauma robs you of the ability to relate to others in a way that you ought to. That's number one. Number two is the increase of the violence itself. Thirdly, it is our Christian mandate to speak and work for justice and peace. And that is why it is my concern, because with SGBV, we can't have sustainable peace. We can't have sustainable security. The vision of Thursdays in Black is we will have no more black to wear because there will be no sexual gender-based violence, because the church will have stood firm with the vulnerable, with the survivors, and it will have said enough is enough. Because of our faith, our churches will be able to educate men on positive masculinities. Men and women will have become sensitive and able to actually appreciate the dignity of each other, whether boys and girls or men and women.
For now, however, let us commit to a moment of silence in remembrance of women affected by sexual violence now. Can we please be called to silence on this day? Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Ashe. The launch of this series today is also part one of the PAW, Pan-African Women in Pauline Conference Retreat. This retreat is entitled Sankofa, Pan-African Women of Faith Matter. Over the next few days, or shall I say just a couple days, this series was coordinated by the webinar team to invite you into this moment. This team invited Dr. Erica Elion, the members, Dr. Kimberly Lymore, Reverend Robin Joins, Reverend Lydia M. Waniki, and Dr. Karen Crozier. They are the ones to whom we give credit for coordinating this series. These events are co-hosted by the World Council of Churches, the All Africa Conference of Churches, CETA, the African and African Diaspora 1945 Manchester 2021 Conference, and yes, Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. This 5-month series begins today with 45 minutes spent on the first episode, answering the ancestral call of legacy and leadership. Every third Thursday of the month until March 2021, we will bring you an episode of this series. Each episode will be based on the scholarly contributions of Pan-African Women of Faith, Pauline women, made in the Ecumenical Review in October 2019. It was entitled Pan African Women of Faith and a Vision of Inclusive Global Theological Education. Each section and chapter will be presented through conversation and reflection. You can go to okamene.org and bread.org to learn more about the journal and Pan African Women of Faith in Pauline. I would like to pause here and thank all of the women who contributed to this important work. You will learn more about them and their work as the series progresses. I would like to pause and especially thank my co editor and partner of this work as well, Pan African Women of Faith, Pan African Women Ecumenical Empowerment Network. Since its conceptualization in 2013 at the World Council of Churches 10th Assembly in Busan, South Korea. Yes, I would like to thank my partner, Dr. Amelia Andamave Aho Ekui. I would also like to thank the Communications Department and Publications Desk of the World Council of Churches, Mr. Stephen G. Brown, who served as the WCC editor of the publication, Ms. Marianne Edgerton, the WCC Communications Director, and right here with us today, Mr. Marcelo Schneider, the WCC Communications Officer. Now we turn our attention to the first episode after these wonderful introductions of the partners in this work, answering the ancestral call of legacy and leadership. Cush and Cushite is used 57 times in the Hebrew Bible. Some versions of the Bible translate, quote, Cush as Ethiopia, but this does not necessarily designate the modern country of that name. Dr. David Adamo has suggested that the best translation is simply Africa. The Psalms predicted that one day people would recognize the spirituality of the Cushites and declared that they had been born anew in Zion in Psalms 87, 3 until 6. Isaiah foretold that God would bring forth a remnant from Cush, Psalm 11:11, and a redeemed people bearing gifts to Zion, Psalm 18, 1 to 8. Zephaniah proclaimed that from beyond the rivers of Cush, God's people should bring offerings, Psalm 3:10. Pan-African women of faith are part of this legacy. Since these earliest biblical accounts in Genesis, women of Africa and the African diaspora have played a critical role in shaping this legacy of Judeo-Christian faith. We believe now is the time for deeper understanding of Pan-African women's leadership, from Hagar and Zipporah in the Bible to the modern ecumenical movement and beyond. In this season of Thanksgiving, especially in North America and other parts of the world, including Pan-African places, we especially remember it was the Wampanoag indigenous community that taught the Plymouth colonists strategies in 1621. They taught them how to survive in their, quote, new land. They believed that a negotiated alliance with the Plymouth colonists was wise. So they shared their bounty with the food insecure Plymouth colonists at autumn harvest feasts. Unfortunately, the Wampanoag people's spirit of invitation and negotiation proved to be a grave miscalculation. The successive years of engagements between colonialists and the indigenous communities, including enslaved indigenous African peoples, were marked by the colonial approach of dominance, bitterness, rancor, and even violence. Today, we are still left with the vestiges of this legacy, which has resulted in structural racism and the persistent recalcitrant spirit of division, polarization, and hatred. That said, we offer a prayer with our indigenous ancestors and descendants. It was at the WCC Central Committee in Trondheim, Norway, on the 22nd through the 28th of June, 2016, that a statement from the Indigenous Peoples Conference on Reconciliation, Processes, and Indigenous Peoples was received. Let us pray with Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including Pan-African locations. Let us remember that Indigenous communities matter. Let us pray the statement that they brought to the world in this moment. Will you please join me in this prayer with our Indigenous friends? O God, as Indigenous peoples, we seek guidance from our resilient ancestors, drawing on the strength of the past for a just future, to understand our beginning, our history, and our current realities, and to stand strong in our own identities. We also look to the guidance of the future through the voices of our youth. Our youth have expressed their desire to quote, to see a move towards a decolonized way of thinking and how we communicate across borders and between generations, end of quote. That can inform, quote, a movement for justice and reconciliation, end of quote. Their wisdom has and continues to provide a profound example of strength, solidarity, truth telling, humility, and courage, which has and will revitalize our hope as we take our rightful place in the body of Jesus Christ. May it be so. Amen and Ashe. Now it is my joy to introduce our three honored guests who have contributed to the volume that we have mentioned, to the Journal of the Ecumenical Review. We will bring to you Dr. Agnes Aboom. We will also bring to you Reverend Dr. Ophelia Ortega, and also we will bring to you Dr. Esther Mumbo. We will begin with a recording that was brought to us from Dr. Ophelia Ortega. She unfortunately had technology problems, as did apparently Dr. Aboom, but not to worry. Dr. Ophelia Ortega has prepared herself in advance to share with you. Over to the video to Dr. Ortega.
Warm greetings to our dear sisters, Angelica, Agnes, and Esther. Many thanks for this opportunity to participate in the webinar series. In the Caribbean region, there have been several daring acts. The first historical and revolutionary rebellion of slaves in Haiti. The Caribbean Theology of Liberation emerged in a small Presbyterian theological seminary in Trinidad and Tobago in the decade of the 70s. And the vision of the decolonization of theology happened in our region so early as in 1981. The mother of our land is a Black woman, Mariana Grajales, who gave 7 sons to the struggle against the colonial Spanish power in Cuba. We realize that the decolonization of our minds is fundamental to be aware of the prejudices that inhabit us, in the way we see ourselves, we see others, the way we see society, and how we understand the mission of the church. Thus, decoloniality must be central to our theological reflection and ecclesial practice. However, we need to say that still we live within a patriarchal system in Latin America and the Caribbean, inherited and lived for centuries, a system where macho violence is still present, sometimes through the continued use of psychological rejection and limitations in access to better opportunities of life. This is the situation that we are. And we have hundreds of femicides of women of different races, including in the Aboriginal population. In our contemporary world, one of the most important dilemmas that we are confronted today is the problem of evil. Our responsibility is how we could respond from our faith to the claim of the innocent victims. Theologian Givone Guevara asserts in her book, The Hidden Face of Evil, that possessions, knowledge, courage, and color of the skin have constantly used as evils to make us suffer. The evil of not having, the evil of not knowing, the evil of not having power, the evil of the color of the skin. Many countries in the world were shocked by the phrase that emerged as a groan from the throat of African-American George Floyd. I can breathe. I can breathe. His words arrived in the presence of the liberator God, and God's voice was almost here as it appears in Genesis 4:10. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me for justice from the ground. Theologian Gustavo Gutierrez states in his book, speaking about God from the perspective of the innocent, theology makes an effort to think about the mystery. Those speaking about the mystery of God, that is love and creates for love, we need then to state that because God is love, in essential is anti-evil. Iset Sama, a young pastor of the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba, guide us to receive and appreciate the power movement in Cuba and in the Caribbean. She is the main leader of the power movement in Cuba and in different ecumenical organizations in the Caribbean. In her words, we could see and hear the pain of her mind and body. She says, I am black, a reality since birth, but an identity I have not dwelled always with. Some years ago, to hear phrases like, you are almost white, you don't look black, or your hair isn't that kinky, were moments I interpreted as flattery. When my encounter with God, the new beginning of my journey of conversion, did not change this scenario. As in the rest of the society, in church I heard the same phrases, the same words, the same jokes, the same affirmation that everything black was evil and everything white was good. It was my vocational awakening, attending seminary, Evangelical Theological Seminary in Matanzas, Cuba, that kindled in me and allowed for me to recognize my identity. It changed my life forever. It wasn't a particular class, hearing the precise words that removed the scales from my eyes. I saw myself for the first time for what I am, a black woman. When I look back, I felt shame. I was a victim, but I was also part of the mechanism of discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization of blacks in society and churches. With indignation and pain, today we repudiate the brutal assassination of a young black man in the United States. He's not the only one. There have been many and more will occur. This act is nothing but the consequence of a bigger evil that begins with jokes that might appear innocent, but end up in systems of exclusion, rejection, discrimination, and death. According to the Cuban sociologist Gisela Aranda, since the end of the 20th century, a trend has emerged that has been baptized the neo-racism or new races, to try to decode the true roots of the mechanism of rejection of different identities that are articulated from races, a phenomenon that integrates gestures, phrases, jokes, criticisms, and comments that devaluate the racial condition of people, groups, or institutions. It is not about simple gestures or opinions marked by racial prejudice, but about behaviors that they exercise such prejudice without regard and are produced today continuously in public spaces, institutional or not, including the media and advertisement, and which are harmful and humiliating to those against whom it is directed. In my article for Ecumenical Review of the World Council of Churches, we express first the need to organize seminars in Latin America and the Caribbean, like those sponsored by WCC Powen, in order to give visibility to Black women and Aboriginal women, theologians of our regions, with their vision of commitment and action. Likewise, continue promoting the campaign Black Thursday. This initiative is a wonderful one, excellent, in a way that we raise awareness on violence against women and girls. Second, we receive with great gratitude in our theological institutions the reflection of our dear sister Dr. Esther Mombo in the International Twin Consultation, the years 2015 and 2016, expressing the need to engendering theological education to learn and to discern God's will and truth in every context. The testimony of struggle and pain that I share with you of our Cuban pastor, Iser Sama, gave to us the opportunity to see that we need to include the pilgrimage of justice and peace with Pan-African women of faith in our theological institution. Third, to end my brief comments, I would like to mention the main contributions of the global consultation in Jamaica in the context of the 70th anniversary of the World Council of Churches and the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Decade of the Churches in Solidarity with Women, hosted by the Council of Churches in Kingston, Jamaica, October 1 to 6, 2018. The participation of quite a number of African descended women impressed us the most. Listening to their life stories was most enlightening. It made us understand better the reality of the context of oppression in which they live, and we could value the relevance of the power movement today. Besides, the Black Thursday movement was also relevant in the consultation. We were wearing black tops to all our program visits in Jamaica, proclaiming in this way a permanent denunciation of violence against women and condemnation of feminicide in all regions of our planet. The strategies that the consultation offered to the World Council of Churches should be integrated into three programmatic areas: unity and mission, ecumenical theological education, and formation and public witness, and transversal such as just community of women and men and ecumenical youth engagement. We need to encourage research on gender justice in member churches in partnership with theological institutions and networks to influence multidimensional, transcultural, and transreligious curricular development in our theological institutions. Many thanks for your company, support, and help.
I'm sure you join me in thanking the Reverend Dr. Ophelia Ortega in her amazing remarks. Just a bit more about this amazing woman. Reverend Dr. Ophelia Ortega Soares was the first Presbyterian woman to be ordained in Cuba. She did serve as the rector of the Evangelical Theological Seminary in Matanzas from 1996 to 2004. It was leading to a multifaceted ministry of social service and community involvement. And yes, it was from 1988 to 1996 that Dr. Suarez worked at the World Council of Churches as the executive secretary for Latin America and Caribbean in the program of theological education. And from 1985 to 1988, she was the professor at the Ecumenical Institute of Balsay of the World Council of Churches. And later, she became a president of the World Council of Churches. Dr. Ortega, thank you once again for your amazing leadership over many years, a matriarch and mentor to many of us, including myself. Let us now move to the introductions of the moderator of the World Council of Churches. We have mentioned her before. We regret the recording didn't work earlier, but we do have another presentation that we will bring to you because it's important in this moment to hear from her. We regret the unfortunate technology differences. In the global space, we know this is a reality, so we move forward. Dr. Abulum is a Kenyan Christian organizational worker who serves as the first Pan-African woman of faith moderator of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, which is the highest governance role of the World Council of Churches. She was elected in 2013 at the 10th World Assembly, where Paween, Pan-African Women of Faith, was conceptualized. She represents the Anglican Church of Kenya. She is the former executive director of the organization TAPCO Research and Development Consultants. This is a group that works at the grassroots and at multilateral levels globally to bring power and to bring mutually communities all over the world, but particularly in Kenya. It was established in 1997 and again focuses on the work of civil society and aid agencies. Let us now hear a word from our moderator, Dr. Agnes Abua.
What's the significance of WCC and worldwide ecumenical engagements? What does it mean in today's political, economical, educational, and social context?
The World Council of Churches in particular remains the global platform that convenes the Orthodox, mainline Protestant churches, and in recent times, the Evangelical Pentecostal movement members. The significance of the World Council of Churches is that it provides a global joint voice of the global church on matters of economy, politics, social issues, and even education. Particularly when we look at the history of the ecumenical movement, three pillars have been at the heart of the movement. One is the agenda of social justice. Second is the agenda of unity of the church, and therefore interrogating issues around faith and order, doctrinal matters. What is it that divides us? How do we enhance the unity of the church? And at the level of politics, the ecumenical movement, particularly the membership of the World Council of Churches, was at the very heart of inputting the formulation of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So up to now, the ecumenical movement still holds these three pillars, including evangelism, mission and evangelism, which joined the three pillars. So now, when we look at the current situation, the platform still remains one where Christians and non-Christians bring their issues around justice and peace. And that is so critical because we live in a world where there are serious deficits of justice and peace. When we look at the political engagement, we recognize that there is an erosion of the democratic processes and the rule of law, and that is why the Church's Commission on International Affairs plays a critical role of engaging with the relevant bodies, including the United Nations.
Thank you. That's about the first question.
Yeah.
All right. What's the impact of ecumenical engagements for the future? Share your views on the need for armies and other communion to work together more than ever to address many social justice issues confronting world societies.
The relevance remains because the prayer of our Lord Jesus Christ, that they may be one, has not yet been fulfilled. Secondly, we've seen a narrowing of differences where increasingly the World Council of Churches and the ecumenical movement engages very critically with the Vatican, that is the Roman Catholic Church, on a number of issues. It is important to note that ecumenical movement remains the hope for those that are actually on the margins. And as our mission commission clearly stated, we today need to address concerns of the people from the margins, whether it is in mission work and evangelism or whether it is the political space. We've seen forces of division, forces of violence increasing, And maybe one of the areas that the World Council has lifted and the ecumenical movement increasingly engaging from an interfaith perspective as well as highlighted is the issue of children, the rights of children. And as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Convention of the Right of the Child, it has been very critical that the child receives a center stage in terms of being protected from violence, from poverty, but also being afforded safe space even within the worship spaces. Secondly, it is the role of women, recognizing that women remain the pillars of society. They are custodians of cultures and values, some of which are archaic, very dehumanizing, and hence the need to empower and transform their thinking. And so during these past years and going into the future, we need to look at the gender-based violence, sexual violence, which affects both men and women. And I think the ecumenical movement is wrestling with those issues. When we look at the economy, we know that liberal economy is actually devastating to many, many countries where services are not being delivered, poverty is resurfacing, issues of refugees and migrants where borders are being closed. The ecumenical movement is very vocal with its members around these matters.
Now we would like to bring on Dr. Esther Mumble. Dr. Mumble is the Associate Professor in the Theology Department at St. Paul's University in Ahumuru, Kenya. She was previously the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Academics. She teaches church history and theologies from women's perspectives and interfaith courses and writes on women's issues, evangelism, HIV/AIDS, and also Christian-Muslim relations and poverty in Africa. She works closely with the Program on Christian and Muslim Relations in Africa and is a member of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. She earned her Master's of Philosophy from Trinity College in Dublin and her PhD at Edinburgh University in Scotland. She serves as the Vice Moderator of the Ecumenical Theological Education Unit of the World Council of Churches, the unit to which Pauline and Pan-African Women of Faith is related. Bringing on now Dr. Mumble.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. Thank you so much for asking me to participate in this webinar this afternoon or this morning or this evening. I was delighted to be part of those that contributed to the review when we were looking at different aspects, and I was looking especially at an inclusive theological education. Thank you so much for those words of introduction. Just to say something about myself, as it has been said, and also to comment on what I wrote in the context of Pawin in relation to answering the ancestral call of legacy and leadership. I am a third-generation Christian, brought up by a grandmother who was the first one in our village to join the mission or to join the church or to become a Christian. For her, it was a very difficult decision to make because it was how do you break with what you've been brought up with and join this new movement. But she joined and faced up with the challenges and was able to hold together the traditional ways in which she was brought up and these new ways of the Christian faith. She brought up her children in that form of Christian faith and brought up her grandchildren, me being one of them. My grandmother and a host of women have been support to us or to myself in my theological journey. My grandmother was my first pastor, my first Christian educator, and the first woman to encourage me to study theology at a time when it was unheard of when the question was, if you study theology as a woman, what are you going to do? In encouraging me to study theology, she did warn me that the church and theological education is a space of men. In fact, she used to say it's a place of jackets. And it is going to theological school that I realized what she meant by saying it is a space of jackets. I realized how exclusive theological education was, both in terms of delivery and in terms of content and in terms of those who took it, because I was a minority in class, and as women, we were minorities in the whole institution. It is going through this exclusive space that I continue to ask myself questions that my grandmother had also helped me to ask and to answer. Why is it that in the church, there are so many women in the pews, but very few in leadership? At theological school, I was asking myself, why is it that there is very little written by women, and even what is written is never used in teaching theology? With those questions, I studied theology, but thank God that in 1989, African women, under the leadership of Professor Amba Obioye, we call her Auntie Mercy, realizing and recognizing the same problem, had put together women and created the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians to be able, A, to write theology that would impact theological education, to mentor women in writing theology. And it is that community of women that has supported me in teaching theological education, writing theology, and exercising leadership in theological spaces. So the legacy of my grandmother and other women mentored me to do that. And that's why I also work hard to mentor others to continue writing theology. In the article, therefore, that I wrote, I was looking at how African women theologians have written theology and how women in America have written theology in regard to womanist theology. Most important for me was to look at what have African women written and how are we using that in theological fora. And 4 areas were very important, like the African woman's theology, who are looking at issues of evil, issues of ecclesiology, issues of leadership. African women theologians also were looking at similar things because of the way theology and theological education have had excluded women. So for African women theologians in writing theology, 4 areas were important. One was a restored focus to the Bible. And as Dr. Musimbi Kanyoro observes, is that the Bible is a message of liberation for African women, much as it is also used to deny their freedom. So women writing theology endeavored to look at the Bible again, interpret it from their experiences, and use it for their own liberation. And second was an objective critique of African culture. I grew up in a home where African culture was practiced and continues to be practiced. But in looking at that culture, there were aspects that were affirming and there were aspects that were very oppressive. for African women theologians in writing theology is looking at culture in a way that it liberates, looking at aspects of culture that are liberating, because African women are custodians of culture. Is having a voice to name those affirming aspects and a voice to name those aspects that are very oppressive, and bringing that in the theological forums and discussing it, using it to discuss theology. Because for other writers of African theology, they would take African culture wholesome and not interrogate issues around power, exclusion, and oppression. The third aspect that women brought into the theological forum for discussion was violence against women, gender-based violence, sexual gender-based violence, an aspect that unites women all over the world, whether it was African American women or African women, that one of the common themes is they all suffer violence. So African women theologians, therefore, decided this is a topic that cannot be discussed in the margins, but has to be brought in the center of theology. African women theologians realized that pandemics like Ebola, like HIV, bring out those monsters or ghosts of violence. And if I had to do the paper again today, I would say the COVID-19 pandemic has yet again brought to light that ghost or demon of gender-based violence. And so in the center of theology, like the African American sisters, African women brought to the fore naming and shaming and discussing gender-based violence. Fourthly, it was to look into the context of doing theology. And the context is that of multi-faith. And African women chose that one of the ways to do theology that is relevant is to ensure that sisters from other faith traditions should be engaged in also writing theology. So the interfaith context, the multi-faith context was taken on seriously, hence writing theology from that perspective. In doing this, the African women were bringing to light liberation. And as the late Anna Simiyu observes, is that Jesus inaugurated the restoration of individuals and societies to wholeness, and he invited the disciples to participate in this reestablishment. As Christians and as women who have seen the liberating power of Christ, we have two functions to fulfill. First of all, to witness to God's love and care for the universe. And second, to give testimony to the continued human responsibility of creating a new world. So African women theologians, in doing their theology, is participating in their own personal liberation, but also the liberation of the world. So as a theological educator, therefore, that has been the journey. And in this paper, I show that theological education, though exclusive, it is important for women as individuals to be included, but women's writings and theological ways should be also included. The method with which the African women have done theology has been narrative, telling their story, telling their experiences, and interpreting those experiences theologically. I conclude, therefore, by saying that theology and theological education need to be relevant to the context in which it is being offered. This is because theology is part of a society's culture, not only in that its content is significantly shaped by culture, but also because its meaning cannot be conveyed separately from culture. The message of theology is always communicated through a particular culture. For example, in teaching his disciples, Jesus used agrarian illustrations to point to theological truths. So both African American womanists and the circle of concerned African women theologians or theologies speak to the contextual realities of women they write about and for. These realities are not only for women, but for the society that justifies marginalization and exclusion of any kind. So in theology, therefore, and theological education, one of the things that we bring to light is to challenge the triple oppression of women. For Africa is to challenge the oppression from aspects of African culture, is to challenge the oppression of colonialism and neocolonialism and other colonialisms. It is to challenge the patriarchal church and forms of patriarchal Christianity that continues to grow. It is to help men and women to be liberated from oppression. It is Bishop Tutu who says that the oppressor needs to be liberated from oppressing, and the oppressed need to be liberated from being oppressed. Thank you.
Well, again, I know you join me in thanking Dr. Mumbo for her wonderful insights on theological education, and particularly as it relates to Pan-African women. We are so grateful for your legacy, Dr. Mumbo, and all that you have done, and for your support of Pauline as our vice moderator of the Theological Union of the World Council of Churches, in which this work is located at the WCC. We are so grateful to Dr. Ortega, Dr. Abuam, and also Dr. Mumbo for launching this series today. As you can see, you're in for a real treat every third Thursday of each month through the month of March. Put it on your calendar, 7:30 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, third Thursdays. You will hopefully spend time with us in deepening your understanding on the contributions of the volume and conversations with the authors who bring amazing insights for this timely moment of Pan-African engagement in the wider ecumenical space of empowerment. Episode 2 will address the publication chapter on Lament, Hope, and the Bible, Part 1. That will be on Thursday, December the 17th, 2020. Yes, 1 month away, exactly, almost. That is, again, Thursday, December the 17th at 7:30 in the morning. The liturgical focus will be on the season of Advent, and the specific focus will be on Jesus being born into struggle, with an emphasis on Mary, a single pregnant mother to be, in a context where a government edict to destroy the child was issued. In spite of all of this, Mary still praises God in her Magnificat, found in Luke 1:46 to 55. And yes, the image of the Black Madonna will be important for us in that moment. The publication contributors will be Dr. Rachel T. Leslie from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Dr. Erica Elion, coming from the United States, and the contribution of Dr. Epi Trezel Marsol from Jamaica. The moderator will be the Reverend Dion Boissiere, who serves as the chaplain at the United Nations Church Center in New York City. And I do believe some of these contributors are on this webinar today, so thank you. We now end thanking you for joining us. You can find a recording of this webinar at okemene.org on the YouTube channel of the World Council of Churches. Again, that's okemene.org, or you can just simply type in World Council of Churches at the World Council of Churches YouTube channel. You can also find out more about this series on the Pawing page of the World Council of Churches, okemene.org. All of the listings of the themes, and it will be updated with the speakers, will be on that page. If you have questions, I have already put it in the chat. Please enter in the chat now. We'll keep it on a little longer, and we ensure that we will relay your questions to the speakers and they will come back to you. But please put your email address so we know where to send the response. Thanks to all who have made this launch possible. For those continuing with the conference retreat, that is today and tomorrow, we will see you shortly in about 90 minutes on the other link that has been provided to you. God bless, and thank you so much for being a part of this series.